On a storm-heavy night in the hills of Asheville, a former U.S. Marine sat alone with a past he thought he had buried and a future slipping through his fingers. When a soft knock came at his door, he nearly ignored it. Outside stood a young woman holding a trembling golden retriever, asking only for shelter from the rain. He let her in, and that single choice quietly set something powerful in motion. Within days, old wounds reopened, hidden tensions surfaced, and forces far bigger than a broken-down car began to close in. This isn't just a story about betrayal or business. It's about the moment a man must decide who he truly is, when everything he has left is on the line. Before the story begins, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to follow a journey where survival turns into responsibility, and one choice changes everything. Rain tore across Montford Hill in relentless sheets, wind dragging branches against the cedar siding of the small house overlooking Asheville's dim city lights. Inside that house, Daniel Brooks sat alone at his kitchen table, the room lit by a single lamp to conserve electricity. He was 42, broad-shouldered and solid even after years out of uniform. The discipline of the U.S. Marine Corps still shaped the way he moved, measured, economical, alert. His dark hair was cropped short, threaded faintly with gray at the temples. A trimmed beard framed a jaw marked by a thin scar running from ear to chin, a souvenir from a roadside blast overseas. His eyes were steel blue and steady, but tonight they carried fatigue. On the table lay an envelope stamped "Final Notice" in red ink. Daniel read it again, even though he already knew the numbers by heart. 3 missed payments. 30 days to settle the balance. After that, foreclosure. This house was the last thing he had left. 3 years earlier, Daniel had co-founded a mid-sized construction firm. He had trusted the wrong partner. Financial discrepancies surfaced too late. Contracts collapsed. Investors fled. Lawsuits followed. By the time the dust settled, Daniel had lost his company, most of his savings, and whatever confidence he once had in his own judgment. Thunder cracked overhead. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the storm like a rifle shot. Daniel stiffened. No one came up Montford Hill after dark in weather like this. The area had seen its share of staged breakdowns and porch ambushes. His body reacted before his thoughts did. Shoulders squared, breath controlled, footsteps silent as he approached the door. He looked through the peephole. A young woman stood on the porch, soaked through, clutching something golden in her arms. Daniel unlatched the door but kept the chain secured. Rain lashed sideways the moment he cracked it open. Up close, she looked no older than 24, tall and slender, with long chestnut hair plastered against pale skin. Her features were refined but not delicate. Strong cheekbones, determined mouth, eyes a deep hazel that held both exhaustion and quiet resolve. She was trembling, but not panicked. In her arms was a golden retriever puppy, about 6 months old. Thick, honey-colored fur darkened by rain, oversized paws. Intelligent brown eyes that studied Daniel without fear. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice clear despite the wind. "My name is Emily. My car broke down about a mile down Modford Drive. The storm hit faster than predicted. I just need to call roadside assistance." Her tone was polite but steady, educated, controlled. Daniel scanned the road behind her. Empty. The puppy wriggled free and dropped onto the porch, landing awkwardly before trotting straight toward Daniel. It pressed its wet nose against his boot and gave a small, hopeful wag of its tail. Daniel froze. He had not touched a dog since Ranger. Ranger had been a German Shepherd canine assigned to his Marine unit in Helmand Province. Intelligent, loyal, unshakable. Ranger had died shielding Daniel from shrapnel during an IED blast. Daniel had never allowed himself to replace him. Now this golden pup stood there, dripping rainwater on his porch, looking up at him as if he had already decided something important. "He's Buddy," Emily said softly. 6 months old. He's usually braver than this." Daniel studied her clothing without appearing obvious. The coat was high-end wool, tailored. The boots, handcrafted leather. Not careless purchases. Not cheap. "Phone lines are unreliable in storms," Daniel said evenly. "You can try inside." Emily nodded quickly. "Thank you. I won't be any trouble." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and black coffee. It was modest. Second-hand couch, worn wooden floors, neatly arranged but unmistakably lived in. Nothing luxurious. Nothing careless. Daniel handed her a towel. "Dry him first. He'll get sick before you do." She knelt immediately, wrapping Buddy and rubbing him briskly with practical efficiency. Not squeamish, not fragile. Daniel noticed that. She tried the landline. Static, then silence. "No connection," she said, a crease forming between her brows. It was the first crack in her composure. "The storm's staying until morning," Daniel replied. "Roads'll flood before they clear. You can stay here tonight. Couch pulls out." Emily looked at him carefully then, not with fear, but with assessment, as if she were deciding whether he was the safer gamble. "I promise," she said quietly. "I won't cause problems." "I don't scare easy," Daniel answered. They spoke little after that. She said she had been surveying the neighborhood for a potential project. She did not elaborate. Daniel did not press. Marines were trained to recognize boundaries. Buddy, meanwhile, had already chosen his place, curled at Daniel's boots, chin resting against his foot as though anchoring him there. For the first time in months, the house did not feel entirely hollow. Near dawn, Daniel rose quietly and stepped outside to inspect the road conditions. The storm had weakened to a steady drizzle. Emily's SUV sat along the curb, sleek and expensive, entirely out of place on Montfort Hill. Daniel approached the vehicle, intending only to check for obvious engine issues. As he moved toward the rear, his gaze caught something through the rain-specked glass. In the cargo area lay a leather portfolio embossed with silver lettering. Even through the distorted reflection of early morning light, he could read the name clearly. Harrison Development Group. Daniel's jaw tightened. That corporation had been buying parcels across Asheville for months, including the deteriorating neighborhood where he had grown up before it was abandoned to neglect. Inside his house, Emily stirred, unaware that the quiet shelter of one stormy night had just shifted into something far more complicated. The morning after the storm arrived with a fragile kind of sunlight. The hills around Montfort looked scrubbed clean, the sky pale and almost innocent, as if it had not tried to tear the world apart just hours earlier. Daniel stood beside Emily's SUV with the hood open, sleeves rolled up, fingers steady despite the cold metal beneath them. Up close, in daylight, the damage was obvious. The alternator belt had snapped clean through. He worked without wasted motion. That was how Marines were trained. Economy of action. Precision. No drama. Emily stood a few feet away, holding Buddy's leash. In sunlight, she looked less like a frightened stranger and more like someone accustomed to control. She was tall, nearly Daniel's height when standing straight, with the kind of posture that suggested years of structured education and expectation. Her chestnut hair had dried into soft waves around her shoulders. Her coat, now clean and brushed, was unmistakably expensive. She wasn't just passing through. Buddy, however, was pure and uncomplicated. 6 months old, oversized paws, golden coat glowing warmly against the gray morning. His dark brown eyes followed Daniel's every movement. When Daniel tightened the temporary belt and stepped back, Buddy barked once, sharp and proud, as if approving the repair. Emily smiled faintly. "He likes you," she said. "Dogs don't overthink things," Daniel replied. "They decide fast." The engine turned over. Relief softened her face. For a moment she hesitated before speaking again. "I owe you honesty," she said quietly. Daniel closed the hood. "I wasn't just driving through." He said nothing, just waited. My family's company is evaluating redevelopment in East Asheville, she continued. The lower district. Daniel's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. That neighborhood. He grew up there, before it declined, before investors circled it like vultures. They want to replace most of it with commercial property, she added. Retail, parking structure, luxury apartments. And you? Daniel asked. I disagree. There was no hesitation in her voice now. I think it can be restored, preserved, rebuilt without erasing the people still living there. Daniel studied her carefully. You don't look like someone fighting her own company. Her lips curved slightly. You'd be surprised. Buddy pulled gently toward Daniel again, sitting beside him as if already choosing sides. The tow truck arrived shortly after. The driver stepped out, a stocky man in his mid-50s with a tobacco-roughened voice and sun-weathered skin. Earl Whitman, born and raised in Asheville. He had the relaxed wariness of someone who had watched developers come and go for decades. Montford's hard on belts, Earl muttered as he hooked the SUV. His eyes lingered briefly on Emily's vehicle. He knew what kind of money it represented. He also knew who usually paid for it. Daniel didn't introduce Emily beyond her first name. Some boundaries were instinctive. Before leaving, Emily extended her hand. Her handshake was firm, not decorative, not fragile. Thank you, Daniel, she said. Not just for the car. He gave a short nod. Storms pass. She held his gaze a second longer than necessary. Then she was gone. The house felt different after that. Quieter. Not emptier, but aware of absence. Buddy's warmth had lingered like a memory Daniel hadn't asked for. 2 weeks passed. Daniel took small repair jobs, porch beams, drainage corrections, a collapsed retaining wall for Mrs. Parker, a thin, silver-haired widow who paid him exact cash in envelopes and insisted on lemonade breaks. You're a good man, she once told him. Daniel didn't answer. Good men didn't lose companies. Good men didn't sign paperwork without double-checking numbers. The second mortgage letter arrived on a Thursday, 30 days. After that, foreclosure. Daniel stood at the sink, holding the envelope longer than necessary. Then he folded it neatly. Neatness was control. Control was survival. That afternoon, a black Mercedes sedan climbed Montford Hill slowly, tires crunching over gravel. Daniel stepped onto the porch before it stopped. The rear door opened first. William Harrison stepped out. He was taller than Daniel expected, lean, angular, silver threaded through dark hair, tailored charcoal suit sitting perfectly across his frame. His face was sharp, composed, the kind of face that had negotiated boardrooms into submission. But there was no arrogance in his expression, only calculation. Emily stepped out behind him. Buddy leapt from the car and trotted toward Daniel as if returning home. Harrison extended his hand. His grip was firm, controlled. Mr. Brooks, he said evenly, thank you for assisting my daughter during the storm. Daniel nodded once. She needed help. Not everyone opens their door. Inside, Harrison declined coffee and remained standing. He did not waste time. My company is reassessing the East Asheville proposal, he said. Emily has made her position clear. Emily met Daniel's eyes but said nothing. I reviewed your background, Harrison continued. Marine Corps engineering logistics, post-service commercial construction management. Early projects were structurally innovative. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. The company failed, he said. Yes, Harrison replied calmly. But failure does not negate skill. The room went still. I'm offering you a consulting role on the redevelopment advisory team, Harrison said. Short-term contract, technical oversight, no political exposure. Daniel said nothing. Behind him, on the counter, lay the mortgage letter. Emily watched him carefully. Buddy rested against Daniel's boot again. Trust. Simple. Undeniable. Finally, Daniel spoke. I'll review the terms. Harrison slid a thin leather folder across the table. Daniel opened it. The title page read, Executive Project Oversight, East Asheville Renewal Initiative. His eyes moved downward. Acting Project Director, Mark Dalton. The name hit like cold water. 3 years ago, Mark Dalton had been his partner. 3 years ago, Daniel had signed documents trusting him. 3 years ago, Daniel had lost everything. Emily saw the change in his face first. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Daniel closed the folder. "Your project director," he said, voice level but colder now. "I know him." Outside, the wind shifted through the trees. Not a storm, but something was coming. The first project meeting was held 3 days later in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Asheville, where the Blue Ridge Mountains hovered blue and distant beyond the skyline. Daniel arrived early. He wore a clean but simple charcoal jacket over a pressed shirt, nothing corporate, nothing flashy. He stood near the window, arms loosely folded, observing reflections instead of the view. Old habit. Marines learned to read rooms before they read faces. When Mark Dalton entered, the air shifted. Mark was 45 now, taller than Daniel by an inch, lean but not athletic. His once boyish features had sharpened with age into something more angular and guarded. His hair, once thick and sandy blonde, was now meticulously styled, flecked with silver at the temples, in a way that looked curated rather than natural. He kept a clean shave, but his jaw was tight, muscles flickering when he clenched his teeth. His eyes were pale green, calculating, assessing, always measuring value. He had the demeanor of a man who had survived a fall and climbed back differently. "Daniel," Mark said, offering a smile that never reached his eyes. "Didn't expect to see you here." His voice was smooth, practiced. He had always been the negotiator between them, the one who charmed investors while Daniel handled logistics. "Consulting," Daniel replied evenly. Mark's gaze lingered a fraction too long. "Good. Fresh perspectives are healthy." Healthy. The word tasted false. Emily entered shortly after, dressed in a tailored navy blazer, posture upright, expression focused. She looked different here, less like the storm-soaked woman on Daniel's porch and more like someone raised to navigate corporate battlefields. But Buddy's leash was looped discreetly around her wrist, the puppy lying obediently at her feet beneath the conference table. His golden fur stood out warmly against the cold gray carpet. Buddy's eyes tracked Mark carefully. Daniel noticed. The meeting began with architectural projections displayed across the wall, renderings of sleek glass structures, multi-level parking, retail facades. Daniel watched silently. Then Mark clicked to the revised technical appendix. There were minor adjustments to structural feasibility after our last board review, Mark explained. Cost efficiency requires selective demolition rather than full preservation. Selective demolition? Daniel leaned forward slightly. The numbers didn't match the original feasibility study Harrison had approved. The material salvage ratios were altered. Load-bearing assessments adjusted downward. It was subtle, but deliberate. "Who authorized this revision?" Daniel asked quietly. Mark didn't hesitate. "Executive consensus." Emily straightened. "My father didn't sign off on full demolition." Mark's expression remained composed. "Your father trusts my judgment." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "These changes weren't part of the preliminary submission to the city." A brief silence followed. Mark smiled again. "Technical amendments often occur before final filing." The meeting ended without confrontation, but tension lingered like static in dry air. Later that afternoon, Daniel remained in the building under the pretense of reviewing blueprints. Instead, he requested access to archived drafts of the East Asheville proposal. A young systems coordinator named Alicia Moreno assisted him. She was in her early 30s, petite with sharp dark eyes and shoulder-length black hair tucked behind one ear, efficient, observant, and careful with words. Daniel sensed she had learned discretion early, perhaps from working too long in rooms where men with money controlled outcomes. "I can give you version histories," Alicia said quietly. fingers moving swiftly over her keyboard. But anything past Stage 3 requires director clearance. Stage 3. Daniel leaned closer to the monitor. There it was. Version 3A, preservation-based renovation model. Version 3B, revised demolition-focused model. The timestamp between the two was only 18 hours apart. Who accessed the file between these uploads? Daniel asked. Alicia hesitated. Director credentials, she said finally. Mark Dalton. No executive co-signature, no documented board amendment. Daniel felt something old stir in his chest. 3 years ago, discrepancies had begun the same way. Small adjustments, subtle shifts in documentation that didn't raise alarms until too late. That evening, Daniel returned home as twilight settled across Montford Hill. The house was quiet again, but not as hollow as before. Buddy had been left with him temporarily, Emily citing late meetings. The puppy greeted Daniel with boundless enthusiasm, tail sweeping across the hardwood floor like a metronome of uncomplicated loyalty. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with printed copies of both file versions spread before him. He traced the cost differentials. The demolition plan funneled material contracts toward one supplier, a subsidiary firm he recognized, Dalton Infrastructure Holdings. His phone buzzed. An email notification. No subject line, no sender name, only a masked address. Daniel opened it. Attached were scanned financial documents from 3 years ago. Internal transfer logs, capital redirection reports, the exact week his firm had collapsed. And beneath the attachment, only 3 words. Don't dig deeper. Daniel's jaw tightened. He opened the attachment slowly. The numbers aligned in a way they never had before. Offshore routing, temporary shell vendor accounts, funds redirected from joint project reserves into a holding entity. Dalton Infrastructure Holdings. Not incompetence, not market failure, manipulation. Buddy padded closer, resting his head against Daniel's knee as if sensing the shift in air. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly. 3 years of self-blame cracked open in a single, silent realization. Mark hadn't merely survived the collapse. He had engineered it. The room felt smaller. The storm from 2 weeks ago had been loud and visible. This one was quieter, more dangerous. Daniel reopened his eyes and stared at the mortgage letter still sitting on the counter. Foreclosure in 30 days. Mark controlling the redevelopment. Evidence resurfacing with threats attached. He exhaled slowly. Marines were trained to assess terrain before engagement, and for the first time in 3 years, Daniel understood the terrain clearly. This wasn't coincidence. This was unfinished business. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees again, softer now, but insistent. Daniel closed the laptop. All right, he murmured quietly to the empty room. Buddy lifted his head. Let's dig. The mountains held their breath under a gray afternoon sky, clouds hanging low over Asheville, as if waiting for something to break. Daniel sat at his kitchen table again, but this time the envelope in front of him wasn't from the bank. It was a printed copy of the email, the threat, the financial trails, the timestamps. Buddy lay stretched across the doorway, golden fur catching what little light filtered through the window. The puppy had grown more confident in the past week, his once clumsy movements steadier, his gaze more protective. At 6 months, he was still all oversized paws and soft ears, but there was something forming in him. Loyalty. Not trained, but chosen. Daniel ran a hand through his cropped hair. He could walk away. He could decline Harrison's offer, return the folder, pretend the past had never resurfaced. 30 days until foreclosure. He needed income, not war. He had fought enough wars. A knock sounded at the door. Not urgent, not timid. Steady. Daniel rose slowly. When he opened it, Emily stood there again, but not the storm-soaked woman from weeks ago. She wore a dark blazer over a simple blouse, her posture controlled, her expression focused. Her chestnut hair was tied back now, revealing sharper lines in her face, less vulnerability, more intent. She carried a leather briefcase instead of a portfolio. "I'm not here as his daughter," she said before he could speak. "I'm here as a lawyer." Daniel stepped aside. Inside, she placed documents carefully on the table, glancing briefly toward Buddy. The puppy rose and approached her, tail wagging but never leaving Daniel's side entirely. "He's adopted you," she said quietly. "He chose," Daniel replied. Emily exhaled. "I reviewed the internal audit trail. Alicia sent me the metadata after hours. Mark's credentials were used to overwrite version 3A with 3B. The access code embedded in the file header is restricted to director-level authority." Daniel leaned back slightly. And my father didn't authorize that change." She held his gaze firmly now. "I need you," she said. The words hung heavier than expected. "You understand structural projections. You understand how the cost matrix would expose inconsistencies." "I can argue legality, but you can prove intent." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're asking me to go to war with your father's project director. I'm asking you to protect what's right." There it was again, that line between idealism and naivety. He studied her closely. Emily Harrison had grown up in boardrooms, not battlefields. But something had hardened in her. Perhaps watching corporate negotiations shape communities without consent had carved something into her character. Perhaps she had seen too much controlled power. "I won't be your weapon," Daniel said evenly. "I don't want a weapon," she replied. "I want truth." Buddy moved between them and sat down, as if grounding the conversation. Daniel looked down at the puppy. "You trust her?" he murmured softly. Buddy wagged once. The decision was not made yet, but something inside Daniel shifted. 2 days later, Daniel returned to the corporate offices under the guise of reviewing demolition feasibility. He carried a portable drive in his pocket, his movements calm, unremarkable. Mark was in his office, glass-walled, elevated, overlooking the drafting floor like a command post. When Daniel entered, Mark looked up from behind a sleek mahogany desk. His posture remained precise, but there was tension at the edges now. "You're digging," Mark said without greeting. Daniel didn't sit. "You altered a structural feasibility file without executive authorization." Mark smiled thinly. "Careful. Accusations without proof damage reputations." Daniel stepped closer. "The metadata is proof." Mark's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened briefly around the pen in his hand. "You were always sentimental about East Asheville," Mark said quietly. "That was your weakness. You couldn't separate business from memory." "And you couldn't separate partnership from profit," Daniel replied. The silence between them thickened. Mark leaned back, voice lowering. "You think exposing this saves that neighborhood? It destroys the entire redevelopment. Investors pull out, communities stagnate." Daniel held his gaze. "You destroyed my company." A flicker, barely visible, crossed Mark's eyes. "You signed those documents," Mark said coldly. "No one forced you." That was true. Daniel had trusted. That had been his mistake. That evening, Daniel received a call. Not from Mark, not from Emily. It was William Harrison. "Mr. Brooks." Harrison's voice was tighter than before, controlled but strained. "The City Council has opened a formal inquiry into the East Asheville proposal." Daniel straightened slightly. "Based on what?" "Allegations of documentation irregularities. Emily must have filed preliminary review, or someone else had." "We face temporary suspension from municipal bidding," Harrison continued, "until the audit concludes." Daniel's eyes moved toward Buddy, who stood alert as if sensing tension. "If the council finds evidence of deliberate falsification," Harrison said carefully, "Harrison Development could be barred from public contracts for 5 years." 5 years. A company like that did not survive 5-year bans lightly. You believe this is accidental? Daniel asked. A long pause. No, Harrison said quietly. For the first time, there was no corporate tone in his voice, only the weight of potential collapse. After the call ended, Daniel remained standing in the kitchen. The war had begun. He had not declared it, but it was here. Buddy walked to the front door and lay down facing outward, head resting on his paws, eyes toward the driveway as if guarding something unseen. Loyalty did not ask for guarantees. It chose anyway. Daniel picked up the folder containing Mark's revisions. The storm weeks ago had been loud and visible. This one would be silent and far more dangerous. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the mountains again. And this time, Daniel did not look away. The mountains held their breath under a gray afternoon sky, clouds hanging low over Asheville as if waiting for something to break. Daniel sat at his kitchen table again, but this time the envelope in front of him wasn't from the bank. It was a printed copy of the email, the threat, the financial trails, the timestamps. Buddy lay stretched across the doorway, golden fur catching what little light filtered through the window. The puppy had grown more confident in the past week, his once clumsy movements steadier, his gaze more protective. At 6 months, he was still all oversized paws and soft ears, but there was something forming in him. Loyalty. Not trained, but chosen. Daniel ran a hand through his cropped hair. He could walk away. He could decline Harrison's offer, return the folder, pretend the past had never resurfaced. 30 days until foreclosure. He needed income, not war. He had fought enough wars. A knock sounded at the door. Not urgent, not timid. Steady. Daniel rose slowly. When he opened it, Emily stood there again, but not the storm-soaked woman from weeks ago. She wore a dark blazer over a simple blouse, her posture controlled, her expression focused. Her chestnut hair was tied back now, revealing sharper lines in her face, less vulnerability, more intent. She carried a leather briefcase instead of a portfolio. "I'm not here as his daughter," she said before he could speak. "I'm here as a lawyer." Daniel stepped aside. Inside, she placed documents carefully on the table, glancing briefly toward Buddy. The puppy rose and approached her, tail wagging but never leaving Daniel's side entirely. "He's adopted you," she said quietly. "He chose," Daniel replied. Emily exhaled. "I reviewed the internal audit trail. Alicia sent me the metadata after hours. Mark's credentials were used to overwrite version 3A with 3B. The access code embedded in the file header is restricted to director-level authority." Daniel leaned back slightly. And my father didn't authorize that change." She held his gaze firmly now. "I need you," she said. The words hung heavier than expected. "You understand structural projections. You understand how the cost matrix would expose inconsistencies. I can argue legality, but you can prove intent." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're asking me to go to war with your father's project director. I'm asking you to protect what's right." There it was again, that line between idealism and naivety. He studied her closely. Emily Harrison had grown up in boardrooms, not battlefields. But something had hardened in her. Perhaps watching corporate negotiations shape communities without consent had carved something into her character. Perhaps she had seen too much controlled power. "I won't be your weapon," Daniel said evenly. "I don't want a weapon," she replied. "I want truth." Buddy moved between them and sat down, as if grounding the conversation. Daniel looked down at the puppy. "You trust her?" he murmured softly. Buddy wagged once. The decision was not made yet, but something inside Daniel shifted. 2 days later, Daniel returned to the corporate offices under the guise of reviewing demolition feasibility. He carried a portable drive in his pocket, his movements calm, unremarkable. Mark was in his office, glass-walled, elevated, overlooking the drafting floor like a command post.
When Daniel entered, Mark looked up from behind a sleek mahogany desk. His posture remained precise, but there was tension at the edges now. "You're digging," Mark said without greeting. Daniel didn't sit. "You altered a structural feasibility file without executive authorization." Mark smiled thinly. "Careful. Accusations without proof damage reputations." Daniel stepped closer. "The metadata is proof." Mark's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened briefly around the pen in his hand. "You were always sentimental about East Asheville," Mark said quietly. "That was your weakness. You couldn't separate business from memory." "And you couldn't separate partnership from profit," Daniel replied. The silence between them thickened. Mark leaned back, voice lowering. "You think exposing this saves that neighborhood? It destroys the entire redevelopment. Investors pull out. Communities stagnate." Daniel held his gaze. "You destroyed my company." A flicker, barely visible, crossed Mark's eyes. "You signed those documents," Mark said coldly. "No one forced you." That was true. Daniel had trusted. That had been his mistake. That evening, Daniel received a call. Not from Mark, not from Emily. It was William Harrison. "Mr. Brooks." Harrison's voice was tighter than before, controlled but strained. "The City Council has opened a formal inquiry into the East Asheville proposal." Daniel straightened slightly. "Based on what?" "Allegations of documentation irregularities. Emily must have filed preliminary review, or someone else had." "We face temporary suspension from municipal bidding," Harrison continued, "until the audit concludes." Daniel's eyes moved toward Buddy, who stood alert as if sensing tension. "If the council finds evidence of deliberate falsification," Harrison said carefully, "Harrison Development could be barred from public contracts for 5 years. 5 years. A company like that did not survive 5-year bans lightly. "You believe this is accidental?" Daniel asked. A long pause. "No," Harrison said quietly. For the first time, there was no corporate tone in his voice, only the weight of potential collapse. After the call ended, Daniel remained standing in the kitchen. The war had begun. He had not declared it, but it was here. Buddy walked to the front door and lay down facing outward, head resting on his paws, eyes toward the driveway as if guarding something unseen. Loyalty did not ask for guarantees. It chose anyway. Daniel picked up the folder containing Mark's revisions. The storm weeks ago had been loud and visible. This one would be silent and far more dangerous. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the mountains again. And this time, Daniel did not look away. The air in Asheville turned sharp and electric, not with rain this time, but with rumor. By Monday morning, Daniel's name was circulating through corporate corridors and online forums tied to municipal development. Mark Dalton had not waited. He had moved first. The accusation came in the form of a formal internal memorandum leaked to a local business journalist. The document described Daniel Brooks as a disgruntled former contractor with a documented history of financial mismanagement, alleging that his claims of file manipulation were retaliatory fabrications. It was a clean attack, professional, restrained, devastating. Daniel read the article on his phone while standing in his driveway. The mountains behind his house looked unchanged, but something had shifted beneath his ribs. Buddy stood pressed against his leg, fur bristling faintly as if sensing tension. At 6 months old, he was still youthful, but his awareness had sharpened. He had begun sleeping by the front door at night, head up at every distant engine. Emily arrived 20 minutes later, stepping from her car with visible anger controlled behind discipline. She wore a fitted gray coat over a navy blouse, her hair pulled into a tight, low knot. She looked younger when upset, less corporate, more human. "He filed a defamation warning," she said immediately. "Pre-litigation notice. If you repeat your accusations publicly, he'll sue." Daniel's jaw hardened. He moved fast. "He wants to discredit you before the audit concludes." They stood in silence for a moment.
Then we don't speak publicly, Emily said finally. We speak legally. She had already contacted an independent digital forensics consultant. His name was Thomas Reed. They met him that afternoon in a small, neutral conference room above a local accounting firm. Thomas Reed was in his late 30s, tall and lean, with sharp features softened slightly by rectangular glasses. His dark hair was cropped close, and a faint scar ran across his left eyebrow. He carried himself with quiet precision, the kind of man who trusted data more than people. Years earlier, he had worked in federal cyber investigations before leaving after burnout from political interference. It had left him skeptical, but methodical.
I don't care about corporate politics,
Thomas said calmly, reviewing the metadata logs Alicia had discreetly forwarded. I care about timestamps. His fingers moved swiftly over his laptop. Version 3B wasn't just edited, he continued. It was accessed remotely at 11:47 p.m. from a secure terminal inside the executive office. Credentials confirm director-level authentication. Which means? Daniel asked. Which means the edit didn't come from a mid-level engineer. Emily's posture straightened. Can this be erased? She asked. Thomas shook his head. Not if we act quickly, but if someone attempts server cleansing, you'll need an emergency preservation order filed with the court. Emily's eyes hardened. I'll draft it tonight. By evening, the legal paperwork was in motion. A digital preservation request was filed with the county clerk, freezing internal server alterations until forensic review completed. It was aggressive, but necessary. Daniel drove back toward Modford Hill just before dusk. Halfway up the slope, Buddy began barking sharply from the passenger seat. A dark SUV sat idling across from his driveway. Tinted windows, engine running. Daniel slowed but did not stop. The SUV pulled forward, maintaining distance. Not random. He drove past his house instead of turning in, continuing down toward the old East Asheville district. The SUV followed for 3 blocks before turning away abruptly when traffic thickened. Buddy continued growling low in his throat. That's not paranoia, Daniel murmured. It was surveillance. That night, Daniel and Emily returned to the abandoned construction site at East Asheville. The skeletal remains of partially stripped buildings stood under sodium streetlights, shadows stretching long and unnatural across broken pavement. Emily carried a small flashlight. Daniel carried a portable drive and a sense of inevitability. The municipal camera system covering the district was managed through a central terminal in a temporary site office, a small prefab structure with steel doors and reinforced windows. Inside, dust floated through the beam of light as Daniel accessed the archived footage. Thomas had instructed him precisely which date and hour to review. 11:32 p.m., 2 weeks ago. The video showed Mark Dalton entering the executive office alone. No assistant, no staff. He carried a briefcase and remained inside for nearly 40 minutes. At 11:47 p.m., lights flickered in the drafting department below. Mark exited at 12:14 a.m., locking the door behind him. Daniel replayed the footage twice. Emily stood very still. That's not a board meeting, she said quietly. No. Buddy suddenly barked again, louder this time. Through the narrow office window, headlights swept across the construction site. The same dark SUV. Daniel killed the interior lights immediately. The SUV slowed at the entrance gate, but did not enter. Just watching. A warning. After several long seconds, it rolled away. Emily's breathing was steady, but her knuckles had gone pale. This just escalated, she said. Daniel nodded. The second storm had arrived. The next morning, they requested an immediate meeting with William Harrison. Harrison's office was larger than Mark's. Clean lines, glass walls, minimal decor. He stood when they entered, tension visible in the slight tightening of his jaw. Daniel placed a printed still frame from the surveillance footage on the desk. Mark Dalton, midnight, alone. Emily added the digital forensic report. Credentials confirm remote edit, she said evenly. Harrison studied the documents in silence. His face remained controlled, but his eyes darkened. "I suspected irregularities," he admitted finally. "But I had no proof." He looked at Daniel directly now. "Why bring this to me instead of the council?" Daniel held his gaze. "Because if this collapses publicly without context, East Asheville loses everything, including preservation." A long pause. Harrison exhaled slowly. "I will suspend Dalton immediately, pending investigation." The decision was measured, but decisive. Emily's shoulders lowered slightly, but Harrison's next words carried weight. "If this proceeds to litigation, my company will face scrutiny beyond this project. Investors will panic." Daniel understood. Truth carried collateral damage. As they left the building, Buddy pressed against Daniel's leg again, tail sweeping slowly. The first storm had brought strangers to his door. The second had drawn lines in concrete. Daniel looked back at the corporate tower rising over Asheville. Mark had played his move. Now the board had shifted. And this time, Daniel was not fighting blind. Spring came quietly to Asheville, as if the mountains themselves were careful not to disturb what had finally begun to mend. The indictment was announced on a clear Tuesday morning. Mark Dalton was formally charged with internal fraud, contract manipulation, and deliberate falsification of development documents. The charges were not dramatic. They were precise. Margaret Cole had built the case without spectacle, presenting time-stamped edits, shell company transfers, and sworn statements with the calm patience of someone who trusted evidence more than emotion. Mark did not look defeated when the news footage showed him leaving the courthouse. He looked smaller. The sharp angles of his face seemed blunted, his pale green eyes no longer calculating, but hollow. For years he had believed intelligence meant control. Now it meant consequence. The East Asheville Restoration Initiative was not canceled. It was rewritten. 60% of the original structures would remain, load-bearing brick facades preserved, interior reinforcement added rather than demolition. A community center would anchor the district, and a block of affordable housing units would be reserved for low-income veterans. The decision was not sentimental. It was strategic. Preservation qualified the project for state rehabilitation credits. Affordable housing secured municipal incentives. Integrity, it turned out, was financially viable. Daniel stood on site the first morning excavation resumed, not for demolition, but for reinforcement. He wore a hard hat now, sleeves rolled up, boots dusted with red Carolina clay. He looked steadier than he had in months. The lines at the corners of his eyes remained, but something in his posture had straightened. Not pride, not defiance, but alignment. Beside him stood Victor Hayes, the newly appointed operations director replacing Mark. Victor was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered with graying hair cropped close and a neatly trimmed salt-and-pepper beard. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles from years of actual construction work rather than desk-bound management. Unlike Mark, Victor listened before speaking. A former Army Corps of Engineers officer, he had left federal service after a flood response failure in Louisiana that had cost lives, a loss that had reshaped him into someone allergic to shortcuts. "We build to last," Victor said simply, reviewing revised blueprints. "Or we don't build at all." Daniel nodded once. That was language he understood. Across the lot, Emily moved between city inspectors and legal representatives with quiet efficiency. She had chosen to remain in Asheville for at least a year, overseeing compliance personally. In the sunlight, she looked lighter somehow, less burdened by inheritance, more defined by choice. Her tailored suits had softened into more practical attire. Boots, rolled sleeves, a leather folder tucked under one arm. She had found her footing not as an executive's daughter, but as an advocate. Buddy trotted freely within the designated safety zone, now wearing a reflective harness. At 7 months old, he had grown into his paws, golden coat thick and glossy under spring light. He followed Daniel instinctively, but his attention often drifted toward the elderly veterans who visited the site to ask about housing eligibility. He would sit beside them without command,
head tilted, as if absorbing their stories. One of them was Thomas Whitaker, a thin, stooped man in his late 70s with pale blue eyes and trembling hands. He wore a faded Marine Corps cap, brim bent from decades of habit. His voice shook when he spoke, not from weakness, but from age layered over memory.
"You were in?" Thomas asked Daniel quietly one afternoon.
Yes, sir.
Thomas nodded slowly. Good to see one of ours still standing. Daniel didn't correct him. Standing wasn't always visible. 2 weeks before his foreclosure deadline, Daniel met with Karen Patel, a local loan officer recommended by Victor. Karen was in her early 40s, medium height, with warm brown eyes and a calm demeanor that came from years of guiding struggling homeowners through restructuring. She wore her dark hair in a low bun and spoke with measured clarity. Unlike most bankers Daniel had encountered during his collapse 3 years ago, she did not treat him like a liability. Your long-term contract changes your risk profile, she explained, reviewing his documents. We can restructure.
Extend term, lower interest, stabilize monthly payment. Daniel absorbed that quietly. You keep the house, she added, simply. That night, Daniel stood on his porch as the sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, light washing the hills in gold. Buddy lay at his feet, head resting on Daniel's boot, breathing slow and content. Emily joined him, leaning lightly against the railing. You ever think about that storm? She asked. Daniel considered. I think about the knock. She smiled faintly. I almost turned around that night, she admitted. 17 doors before yours. Some lights turned off when we knocked. Daniel glanced at her. And you kept knocking. She looked toward the mountains. Sometimes you don't know which door is the right one until it opens. On the day of the official re-groundbreaking ceremony, families gathered in front of the preserved brick buildings of East Asheville. Children played near chalk outlines marking future garden beds. Veterans stood in small clusters, hands folded behind their backs, assessing space with quiet dignity. William Harrison spoke briefly, not with corporate polish, but with restraint. He acknowledged oversight failures, pledged transparency, and introduced Daniel Brooks as Chief Technical Supervisor of the Restoration Initiative. Applause rose, not loud, but steady. Daniel stepped forward reluctantly. He did not like podiums, but he understood responsibility. He looked at the brick walls behind him, the same structures he had once walked past as a boy when visiting relatives in the district. He looked at Thomas Whitaker standing near the front, shoulders straighter now. He looked at families waiting for affordable leases. He looked at Emily, who held his gaze without expectation. Then he spoke. Structures aren't just steel and brick, he said. They're memory. They're second chances. Buddy barked once from the side of the stage, drawing gentle laughter from the crowd. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. That night, back at Montford Hill, Buddy curled beneath Daniel's feet as he sat at the kitchen table, not with foreclosure letters, but with revised blueprints for the community center. The house felt different now. Not larger, not wealthier, just steadier. Outside, the sky was clear. Daniel thought of the storm months earlier, the rain against his door, the decision made in a single breath. There are doors we open because kindness asks us to, and there are doors that open because we finally stop running from who we were. He reached down and rested a hand on Buddy's head. This time, the night was quiet, and he was not alone. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light. They come disguised as a knock on the door, a choice made in quiet courage, a moment when you decide to help even though you are struggling yourself. God often works through ordinary hands, through small acts of kindness that ripple farther than we can see. In daily life, we may never know which decision will change everything. So open your heart, choose integrity, choose compassion. If this story touched you, share it. Leave a comment about a moment God showed up in your life, and subscribe for more stories of hope. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps every single day.